Lecture 2, Coping with Social Information.
Gustav is a composer. For months, he has been carrying on a raging debate with Zoira over who is better, Beethoven or Rossini. I'm not so much for Beethoven qua Beethoven, Gustav argues, but as he represents the German dialectic, the incorporation of more and more notes into the scale, culminating with dodecaphonic democracy, where all notes get an equal hearing. While Rossini was retiring at age 36, womanizing and getting fat, Beethoven was living a life filled with tragedy and grandeur. So, is Zoira's customary answer to that one, which would you rather do? The point is, a person feels good listening to Rossini. All you feel like listening to Beethoven is going out and invading Poland. Ode to joy, indeed. Now, when I was sitting reading Gravity's Rainbow, and I came upon this passage, I got to the end of the passage, and I sort of thought, I guess Beethoven's not so good after all, and Rossini is a little bit better. And then I thought, I've just been persuaded, and what an unusual locale. I had this strong sense that if a clever social psychologist had been standing next to my favorite reading chair and had asked me before I'd read this book, how do you feel about Beethoven and Rossini, and then asked me again after reading this passage, that Beethoven would have come out a little bit worse for the wear and Rossini a little bit better. And I thought that was sort of an unusual thing, because you don't expect to get persuasive information in the middle of a book. It turns out, though, when you take a step back and think about it a little bit, it turns out it should be the case that you should always be on your guard for persuasive information, because you would be hard-pressed to find a situation in which whatever information is being given to you is not intending to change you in some way. So even if it's something as mundane as someone looking out the window and saying, oh, it's snowing, they're still trying to convince you, to persuade you that it really is snowing, and that's kind of mild. There clearly is a large part of your life where people are explicitly and without any embarrassment trying to change your beliefs, to change your attitudes, to change the things that you do, which is generally most important of all. And so it has been one of the major topics of social psychological research to try to examine the factors that lead to effective persuasion, that lead to changing people's beliefs or attitudes or behaviors. This is an enormous literature, and what I'm going to try to do today is to describe to you a particular sort of research that has been most directed at trying to change people's actual behaviors. So if I can only tell you about one thing, we might as well get to the good stuff, which is, sure, you can get people to believe things, you can get them to say things, to have attitudes, but what happens if you really want them to get them to behave in a particular way? And there are a small number of behavioral, persuasive techniques that have been studied extensively. What I want to focus on in each case is not only that they work, and they will work. There's something real for me to teach you now. But why they work, what it is about people, about the way people want to feel about themselves that make these techniques so effective. So the first technique is something called the foot in the door technique. And the image here is that you get your foot in the door, and then you can kind of sell the woman of the house everything that you have in your little black bag. The experimental work here began in the late 60s by Friedman and Fraser. Let me describe an experiment to you that was carried out actually in Palo Alto, California. It happened in two parts. In the first part, experimenters went around and they asked people in Palo Alto neighborhoods to do one of two things. One of the two tasks was that they could ask them to put up a little sign, either in their house or their car. The other of the two tasks was that they asked them to sign a petition about an issue. And then there were two issues. One of the two issues was that people should drive carefully. The other issue was that they should keep California beautiful. So it turns out that on the whole, these are things that people are willing to do. They'll sign a petition that says, yes, we should try to keep California beautiful. It's hard to object. Or put up a little sign that says, sure, everyone should drive carefully. Now the interesting thing is what happens when a different experimenter comes back about 2 weeks later. So now this person knocks on your door, and now he has only one thing in mind, which is that he would like you to put a very big, very ugly sign that says, drive carefully on your lawn. Okay, and in fact, they bring a little photo, a little snapshot that shows a house mostly obscured by this big, ugly sign. Okay. And now the question is, under what circumstances will people say, yes, I'll put up that big, ugly sign? The data are here for you. One remarkable thing, first of all, is that the one contact means that how many people say yes when you've never come to their home before? The answer is 17% of the people say yes. Okay? So we have these folks sitting at Columbia, sitting in a room full of smoke, doing nothing, and meanwhile, there's people out on the West Coast. Sure, I'll put up a big ugly sign on my front lawn, and I've always thought that was sort of remarkable. Okay? But if you look at the rest of the chart, what you'll see is that having appeared at their doorstep 2 weeks before, a different person, a much smaller task, sometimes a different task, sometimes a different issue, you get a remarkable level of compliance. So in the circumstance where it's the same issue, so in both cases you did something about driving carefully, and it's the same task, so both times it had something to do with a sign, now 76% of the people are saying, sure, I will put this big ugly sign on my lawn. But when one of those two things isn't matching, so it's a different issue or if it's a different task, even in that circumstances, they're all around 50%. This compares quite favorably to 17%. This is a remarkable change. And it's a really, this is with a 2-week break. So essentially what has happened is that 2 weeks before this person's come to your door, you've done something nice. 2 weeks later, they'll do this very much bigger nice thing. That's a remarkable sort of thing. You could see why you would want to understand why that would be. And the explanation turns out to be pretty straightforward, which is that there's something about getting people to do good things in this sort of circumstance that makes them feel like people who do good things. It turns out to be a very powerful persuasive technique to just get people to think about themselves as the kind of person who does something good. And it has these very far-reaching consequences that even with this 2-week break, with a big ugly sign, you can get them to work. So that's foot in the door. Okay? And it's important to understand what it would be like to be in that situation, to come to think of yourself as the sort of person who does good things. A related technique that sort of works in the opposite direction is something called door in the face. The image here is that you ask someone to do something, they slam the door in your face, you sort of knock again and say, well, how about this instead? The original work here, the original research was done by a fellow named Cialdini. What he did was to walk up to people on a college campus and said, hi, I'm looking for volunteers to spend 2 years doing treatment, doing counseling for juvenile delinquents. And you will be not surprised to learn that most people say no. You've now put them in a very awkward circumstance. People would like to think of themselves as people who do good things. So the next question you ask them is, well, how would you feel about going to the zoo for 3 hours as a chaperone? And they go, okay, that I'll do. Okay? So if you just walk up to people and say to them, will you go to the zoo for 3 hours as a chaperone, 25% of the time they'll say yes. If you do it first starting with this ridiculously big request, you can pop that up to 56%. So again, that's pretty impressive. You're getting twice as many people to say sure by just asking them kind of this ridiculous question first. Because once again, how are they feeling about themselves? They're feeling as if they are someone who is not a good person. And you can kind of get them to feel bad, and then you kind of hit them when they're low, and they'll say sure. The interesting question, of course, is when should you do each of these techniques? So foot in the door, you should start little and you get big. Door in the face, you start big and get small. So the question is what happens when you compare these at the same time, and I've given you the data again. This is an experiment carried out by Can, Sherman, and Elks. And what they are doing now is they're doing this in Bloomington, Indiana. What they would actually like to get people to do is the moderate-sized request. All of these requests have to do with traffic safety. What they're most interested in is the moderate-sized request, which is, can I send you 15 pamphlets and have you give them out to your neighbors? Okay. The big request in this case is that they ask people to stand on a street corner in Bloomington, Indiana, and record the flow of traffic for 2 hours. People are disinclined to do that. The little request is, could I, hi, I'm from the Citizens Committee on Traffic Safety. Can you answer 3 questions for me? And people say sure. Okay. And what they do in this experiment is they now contrast the effectiveness of starting with, sitting for 2 hours and looking at traffic flow, going down to the 15 pamphlet request, or starting at the bottom and working your way up. And what you find, first of all, is in Bloomington, Indiana, 50% of the people, one contact, are willing to, sure, give me the 15 pamphlets, I'll walk around my neighborhood and give them out. Okay, so both Bloomington and California, both Indiana and California, are pro-social kind of people. What you see, though, is that it makes a big difference whether you want to go to that moderate request immediately or with a delay. If you want to go to immediately, the thing to do, if you want to get up, at least in this experiment, at 90% compliance rate, you should go with door in the face. Start big and go moderate. Make them feel bad about themselves. On the other hand, if you're going to need a delay, which in this case in the experiment was 1 week, don't use door in the face at all. You want to use foot in the door, okay? Because with door in the face, if you ask them a week later, it's going to be down to 29%. So again, you have to kind of put yourself in that circumstance and think how you would puzzle out the situation. with door in the face right away, well, what's happened? You've said no, and for a little while you feel kind of bad, and you say sure as quickly as you can. If you wait a week, then suddenly the person looks manipulative, because it's like, wait a minute, I see what's happening here. You've had some time to think about it. You've had some time to calm down. And now compliance is an all-time low, whereas foot in the door still does pretty well. Okay? So again, the thing to think about when you are in the business of influencing other people, and we are all in the business of influencing other people, is to sort of think about how you're making that person feel about him or herself when you are trying to get them to do something you'd like them to do. The third technique, in fact, involves one of the most powerful ways of getting people to behave in a way you'd like them to, and it has to do with reciprocity. One of the most powerful human instincts is when someone has done something for you, you feel very, very, very much like you should do something for them. This is what reciprocity is. In this experiment, what Berger and some students of his were actually looking at is sort of a late-night TV selling scheme. But wait, there's more, but that's not all. So they're trying to sell you Ginsu steak knives, and but wait, before you call us, if you act now, you'll also get the tomatoes to slice, or something like that. And then they keep making the package better and better. And the question is, does that really work? And the answer turns out to be absolutely. Berger did these experiments actually at a Santa Clara University bake sale, psychology club bake sale. So the way it works is you, as an innocent, hungry person, walk up to their table, and you admire a cupcake, and you ask, how much is the cupcake? And they say 75 cents. But then, before you can decide whether you want the cupcake or not, one experimenter turns to the other, they whisper a little bit in dramatic fashion, they say, but we'll tell you what, you can also have a couple of these nice-looking chocolate chip cookies for the same 75 cents. And the question is now, how many people say, sure, I'll take that? Well, if you just give them the cupcake and the cookies together, if you tell them originally that's the package, only 40% of the time do they buy the package. If you go through this little bit of staging, it pops it up to 73% of the time. Okay? You can do the exact same sort of thing by reducing the price, which is typically what they do for you on television. You do the same thing starting at $1, and then you say, well, you talk to your friend, you said, but I'll tell you what, you're a special friend, we'll give it to you for 75 cents. Once again, it's about the same kind of change. If you just walk up and I tell you it's going to cost 75 cents, only 44% of the time do you say, well, give it to me. But if I've gone through this little bit of staging, it gets you up to 73% of the time. And the explanatory principle here seems to be reciprocity. You've just done something for me. You've done something nice. You've given me a couple of cookies. You've saved me a quarter. And now I have to do something for you. I have to buy this thing from you, okay? Now, at a Santa Clara University bake sale, it doesn't sound like such a big deal. But when you start thinking about exactly what happens, say, when you go in to buy your new car, they do exactly the same sort of thing. They engage the same sort of reciprocity, right? You walk in and they say, well, the list price is $42,000, but we can let you have it for $10 just today. And you're thinking, wow, they've done something really nice for me. I'll buy this car. It's a very powerful thing. And when you start looking for this kind of behavioral technique, you'll see it all the time. And again, what it's doing is it's hooking into this very, very basic reaction, which is that when someone does something for you, you want to do something for them. And it's the story all the way along the way here. These are very basic kind of instincts. If you feel like you're a good person, you keep doing good things. If someone's made you feel like a bad person, you want to remedy that. If someone's done something for you, you want to do something for them. And you can see a lot of the ways in which people persuade you in real life are just hooking in a very basic, very almost primal way into the sort of the way that we like to think about ourselves. What all of this suggests is that we have to be a little bit more aware about the way in which information is working on us. We have to be a little bit more aware on the kinds of things that our people are doing to persuade us. And in fact, it is certainly the case, as I started out at the beginning of the lecture by saying, that we are constantly inundated with persuasive information. And the interesting thing about persuasive information is that in almost every case, it's trying to get us to do things that have to do with making predictions about the future. So for instance, suppose you're trying to persuade me to vote for a particular candidate. How can I make that judgment? Well, what I'm trying to do is somehow go from the evidence that I have about this person and make some kind of prediction about what the effect of having that person in the whatever position would be versus his or her opponent. And that's a hard judgment to make because it's a judgment under uncertainty. I have imperfect information, but somehow I have to decide what to do. And this is going to be true of most real-life situations where what you're essentially trying to do is to make some kind of judgment under uncertain circumstances. And the question is, what can you do? What do you do about that? And this is, in fact, a large research area in psychology now because it describes so much of the human condition, making judgments under uncertainty, making judgments in circumstances where someone is trying to get you to believe something or to do something, or you have to make up your own mind for whatever reason, and you have uncertain information. The experiments that I'm going to describe to you are actually some of the most elegant in psychology, and they all rely on sort of the same underlying sort of methodological principle, which is that one of the ways of exposing that a psychological process is in place is by showing the circumstances in which it would lead you to make an error. The reason I've reproduced a visual illusion for you is because it's a good analogy. So if you look at this illusion, this is called the Mueller-Lyer illusion. Those lines are, in fact, the same length. In fact, if anything, I've cheated and made the line that looks longer just a touch shorter to make sure that if you went home and measured it, you'd see that I hadn't cheated. Okay? It's a very powerful illusion. And what it does is suggest to people who study perception some of the interesting properties about the way that the visual system works. It is the case that in most circumstances you are perceiving veridically. So by inventing situations in which visual perceptual processing breaks down, you can sort of understand something about the visual system. The sorts of cognitive processes, the sorts of social processes that I'm going to describe now, have the same philosophy, that by inventing situations in which you can cause people to make errors, you can sort of see the things that they're doing normally, the point being that in most circumstances it's working without any problem. Okay? What I'm going to be describing to you are a class of processes, of strategies called heuristics. What a heuristic is a shortcut. So the point is that in most circumstances you can't do anything very formal because you don't have certain information. You don't have all the information. And so what you have to do is to have some kind of shortcut, some little trick, some way of making a judgment. So let me give you a very specific example of this from one of the experiments. The research here has been done primarily by Daniel, or was originated by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. They put their subjects in some kind of interesting circumstances. One of them, for instance, one of the very first experiments, asked people, what's a pretty simple question? They said, imagine in 4 pages of a novel, so about 3,000 words, how many words you would find that fit one of 2 schemas. So either 6 blanks, an N, and then a last blank. 5 blanks, an N, and then a last blank. Or 4 blanks, and then ing. Well, it turns out that if you ask people to do this, and typically you're asking different sets of subjects, they estimate that there are 3 times as many words that end ing as have the pattern 5 blanks, an N, and then a last blank. Well, if you look at it when they're put on top of each other, you see why that's a funny thing. Because there have to be more things that have N in the 6th position than ing, because everything that ends ing also has N in the 6th position. There have to be more things. Well, why do people give the wrong answer? Well, the explanation that Kahneman and Tversky gave is something they called availability, and this is meant to be very mnemonic, because words that end ing are easier to think of than words that have the N in that 6th position. So you can think of walking and talking and things like that. If I just give you the N in the 6th place, you're going to spend all the time I allow you to think about it just trying to think of anything if you don't happen upon the ing thing. And so the explanation here, and this is a very stripped down thing, it's not going to surprise any of you, is that it's something called availability. What you're trying to do when you're trying to answer kind of this curious question, how many words would you find in 4 pages of text? What you're trying to do is to think of how many words you can think of. How many words are available, and you get the wrong answer. Same sort of, again, very stripped down sort of circumstance with this question of R in the initial position or R in the 3rd position. It turns out that if I would allow you to think about this at any length, you would typically give the same answer that Kahneman and Tversky's subjects give, which is that they think that words that start with R are much more frequent. It turns out that words that have R in the 3rd position are more frequent. And it's for the same reason. It's very easy to think of words that start with R. It's much harder to think of words that have R in the 3rd position. Now, these are kind of the easy, stripped-down ways of showing the same thing. What's more important, of course, is that you are, in fact, using this strategy on a day-to-day basis. It's inevitable, and that's why you cause people to make these errors, to show its inevitability. And so you can look at some real-life circumstances and show people making the errors. So, for example, some research done by Ross and Sicoli. You talk to couples, and you ask them to sort of assess how much of the work they do as part of the couple. You know, how often do you take out the trash? How often do you make the meals? How often do you get to be the one who chooses to watch the television? You know, what channel to watch or whatever. what you find is that when you add these numbers together, they come out reliably bigger than 100%. So if you add the number of times, the percentage of times I think I dig out the trash, the number of percentage of times my significant other, we think it's much more than 100% together. Because what's happening? Well, clearly, I have much better recollections of what I did myself. They're much more available. So when I think about, well, what's been going on, I think about the last 5 times I took out the trash and how annoyed I am about that. And I don't have access to the times that you took them out, and so I think I did more of the work. Well, this should present to you immediately the difficulty here, because this leads to a lot of friction, because it is the case that people have different recollections of what happened, and to the extent that they are basing their judgments on this kind of what's easily accessed from memory, it's going to lead to these kinds of dismaying frictions, these kind of misassessments of what really is going on. Okay. The other sort of real-life demonstration actually has to do with the way in which people assess risks. So, for example, people who watch a lot of television believe that they are under much greater danger when they leave their homes than, in fact, they really are. This is not going to surprise you. I mean, you can immediately think about why that would be, because every time you turn on the TV, people are being gunned down in all sorts of gruesome fashions, and this upsets people. So, in fact, there's this wonderful little quotation. This is about the first flight of a young Wisconsin couple. Their only knowledge of flight came from newspaper headlines, a knowledge of collisions and crashes and fatalities. They had never read a single report of a little airplane taking off, flying through the air and landing again safely. They could only believe that this must be possible in spite of all of the newspapers, and on that belief, they staked their $3 and their lives. Now, that sounds about right, because everyone sort of knows that we get disproportionate reporting. In fact, the fact that media reports things which, and I'm not meaning to be unfair to the media, typically they report the things we're most interested in hearing about, but the fact that they do report those sorts of things causes people on the whole to have a very skewed idea of what's really going on out there in the world. And now this doesn't even have to be watching 10 o'clock dramas. It's going to be watching the news. So, for example, these are the sorts of questions that have been asked in experiments, and typically people get them wrong. So I could ask you, for example, what is the more frequent cause of death, accidents or diseases? And if I let you think about that for a minute, which I will, typically it's very easy to think of people who have died from accidents. These are very salient. It's harder to think about people who have died from diseases. It's less likely to make it front page in the newspaper. So, in fact, people typically believe that either accidents are more frequent or they believe that disease is more frequent, but they almost always get the proportion wrong. It turns out that you are 15 times more likely to die from a disease than from an accident. And people never come close to that proportion. Homicide versus suicide, which way do you think that goes? It turns out that the answer is suicide. More people kill themselves than are killed by other people by about a 4-3 margin. Once again, you can understand why this would be. It simply wouldn't be seemly to report suicides on the front page in the way that we gleefully report murders. And thirdly, drowning or fire. This is a trick question. In 1979, the number was exactly the same. But that usually surprises people, because fires are much more prominently reported than drowning in most circumstances. So the point is that thinking about the way in which you make these sort of judgments based on the availability of information from memory should start to help you understand why you can have different takes on things. If you start to understand that you're making a judgment not based on everything you've ever known, but the things that are most easy to get to, you can start to understand why you're going to disagree with people, why you're going to have different versions of reality. Okay, so this first heuristic is called availability. It's called availability because you were relying on the sorts of things you can get out of memory. The next heuristic or one of the other heuristics that Kahneman and Tversky have dealt with is what they call representativeness. Again, this is a very simple and elegant idea. Essentially what it relies on is the fact that people, to a large extent, have to make judgments based on similarity, on how representative the current situation is to something they know about already. And by virtue of making judgments based on similarity, based on representativeness, you can cause them to make errors in terms of the real sort of formal probabilistic structure of the world. So here is one problem I've given you. Imagine someone named Bill, who is 34 years old. He is intelligent but unimaginative. He is compulsive and generally lifeless. In school, he was strong in mathematics but weak in social studies and the humanities. Now, as a participant in this experiment, what I would ask you to do is to rate the following possibilities. So I'd ask you to rate whether Bill is an architect, whether Bill is an accountant. People tend to like that option fairly well in this experiment. That gets about everyone's number one rating. Whether Bill plays jazz for a hobby. People don't like that so well. Bill surfs for a hobby. Bill is an accountant who plays jazz for a hobby. Bill climbs mountains for a hobby. Bill is a physician who plays poker for a hobby. What you find is that people really like this option that Bill is an accountant. They really don't like at all the option that Bill plays jazz for a hobby, but they kind of, in the middle, like Bill is an accountant who plays jazz for a hobby. What's wrong? Well, the idea that Bill is an accountant who also plays jazz for a hobby is more restrictive than just playing jazz for a hobby. So it couldn't be more likely. That's just the way that probability works, and I've drawn some Venn diagrams there for you to sort of prove that to you. The point being that the intersection of two things can never be bigger than the smaller of the two things. It can't be more likely that two things could be true than that one of them alone could be true. The explanation here is that the option that Bill is an accountant who plays jazz for a hobby is more similar to this profile than just playing jazz for a hobby alone. So in terms of psychology, in terms of the way you think about this information, it seems like a better option. But in terms of actual formal probabilistic structure, it's not the way that things are supposed to go. You can get this same sort of effect a little bit more purely by looking at the sorts of questions that were actually asked on a day-to-day basis. So imagine that you're just having a conversation and you're trying to estimate a probability, something like what is the probability of there being a massive flood in which 1,000 people drown? Now, the way this was done in an experiment is that the subjects were actually given categories of probability, so 50%, 10%, 5%, or whatever. And what you find is that on the average, people, and these are now students at the University of British Columbia, thought that the probability of there being a massive flood in which 1,000 people drown is only about 2.2%. If you then change the story a little bit and say, what's the probability of an earthquake causing a massive flood in which 1,000 people drown, now people think the likelihood is 3.1%. Okay? So it's not enormously bigger, but it's definitely bigger. It's reliably bigger. People think it's more likely. And you can see, because I put them side by side, what a remarkable thing that is. Now, typically, when I talk about this research, someone wants to say, well, isn't this really just because the people involved, the subjects in these experiments, don't have any background in statistics or probability? Isn't just something about not knowing very much about, how probability works? And to counter that sort of complaint, what Kahneman and Tversky did was to go to something called the International Convention of Forecasters. So not weather forecasters, but people who are the sorts of people who make up these numbers about how likely it is that there's going to be a flood that's going to kill 1,000 people. There are people who do that for a living. Kahneman and Tversky go to this meeting, and they go do exactly the same sort of experiment. So, for instance, they now ask these subjects who do this for a living a question like, what's the probability of the United States suspending relations with the USSR? And they give you a very small number. The number they give you is 0.14%. So they don't think it's very likely at all. You ask a different group of people, what's the probability of a Russian invasion of Poland leading to a suspension of U.S. relations with the USSR? And now they give you a number that's essentially 4 times as big. It's still a small number. It's still 0.47%, but it's much bigger than 0.14%. Okay? These are people who do it for a living, and they're not at all immune to making exactly the same sort of error. Because again, what you've done is you've told them a good story. You've made this idea of Russia invading Poland, yeah, that sounds similar to things that have happened in the past. It's representative. It's similar. The idea of there being this earthquake causing a flood, that's representative of things that have happened in the past. Now, once again, these demonstrations are based on errors and causing errors. Usually, making judgments based on similarity is the right way to go, because typically sort of seeing what situation is this current situation most like is going to give you about the right kind of answer. The point is that you can demonstrate that people are doing exactly that by rigging a situation that will cause them to make a mistake. And what I'm going to describe now are actually some even more real-life situations which have to do with gambling, where you can show that there are some consequences for the way in which people will make gambles as a function of representativeness. These are experiments that were carried out by Ellen Langer. Her first experiment contrasted people's gambling responses to dapper people versus schnooks. Okay? The manipulation here was fairly straightforward. You were coming in to play a game. In one condition, you thought that the guy you were gambling against was a schnook. That was defined by having the person with a sport coat, apparently a little bit of skew, so it would sort of look unkempt. This was run at Yale, so they're very sensitive to those sorts of things. The dapper person was looking sort of dapper. And the question is now, what should be clear to you is that in terms of gambling, it doesn't matter, right? You're gambling against someone. It doesn't matter whether their sport coat is on correctly or not. And in fact, in this experiment, what happens is that what you're doing is you're cutting cards against either this dapper person or this schnook. And so here's a gambling game that in fact involves, as far as I know, no skill whatsoever. You're just cutting the deck and seeing who gets the bigger card. And you're entitled to bet anywhere from 0 cents to a quarter. Okay? And what you do is look at the end of the experiment to see how much money on the average people bet against their opponents. Against the dapper opponent on the average they bet 11 cents. And against the schnook on the average they bet 16 cents. Okay? So again, this is a small difference, but it's perfectly reliable, and it bears no resemblance to anything about the situation. It doesn't matter when you're cutting cards how the person looks. Okay, so this should give you a sense of one thing to be worried about if you ever go gamble again, or maybe something to use to your advantage if you ever go gamble again. But also, it should suggest to you again the way in which people use representativeness. The point is that if what you are doing is analyzing the situation by saying, gee, this person is similar to the sorts of people that I'm generally excelling against, then in fact it sort of makes sense, even though it's not an appropriate situation, to treat the person in that way and to gamble more against them. Another sort of experiment, now not involving college students, going out into the field, what Langer and her associates did was to go to a couple of businesses in the area where they were doing research, and they told people they were having a football pool. So essentially, the explanation was you were going to pay $1 for a football card with the hope of winning $50. The odds were actually 1 in 53. I guess the experimenters wanted to make a couple bucks for their effort. And there are two conditions. In one condition, you are entitled to choose your own card. So what the experimenter says is, here, fans out the set of cards, and says that you can choose the one of those cards that you would prefer to have. Okay? That is known as the control condition because you feel as if somehow you have had some control in that situation by being able to say, sure, that's the card I want. In the no control condition, by contrast, you're just handed one of these two cards. Okay? Now again, you all should know enough about this situation to understand that it just doesn't make a difference which of the two ways you get your card, right? It doesn't change the odds if you picked your own card or you've just been handed one. What happens next, though, is that Langer has her experimenters go back to these places and they explain to each subject, which in this case are these real-world people, they don't know they're being subject, they explain to them someone didn't get a card who would very much like to participate in this lottery, in this football pool. How much would you be willing to sell your card for? Now, it turns out everyone would like to make a little bit of a profit because they're giving up the chance to win $50. So what you find is that even the people who have just been given a card randomly would like $1.96 for their card. So they'd at least make that 96 cents. However, the people who got to actually choose the card themselves want $8.67 for their card. Big difference, right? And it's a curious thing because, once again, it just doesn't matter in terms of the probability of the situation. But once again, you have put the control people typically in situations where you control what's going to happen. That matters. If I give you a circumstance and control your behavior, you are in fact going to do better. The problem is that in this circumstance, people believe that they have control when in fact it's really probability. And in fact, they get $8.67, so it's not such a bad thing. But you can see how in a real-life circumstance, this could lead you to make an error. If I wanted you to gamble a lot of money, say, what I would do would be to give you this kind of illusion of control, which would make you feel as if you are more likely to win that game. And this is clearly the kind of thing that is operating in a lot of gambling situations. Okay? Just one last note on gambling, and this will harken back to talking about things like the fundamental attribution error. It turns out to be the case that when people gamble, when they have a good outcome, they attribute it to skill, and when they have a bad outcome, they attribute it to bad luck. Okay? This is well known to everyone in this room. So once again, you can sort of analyze it. If we're interested in making attributions, you could see exactly how this would go. If what you're interested in is how people look to the world to see the way things happen, it's a very powerful sort of error that people make, and it's, again, one of the reasons that people keep gambling. Okay? So once again, I hope that I've imparted some real-life usable information here, because you can start to look around and recognize these sort of situations in which availability or representativeness are working against you. A third sort of heuristic is one that has been called anchoring. The point of anchoring is that what you often have to do is to start with some kind of information and then move from that to a real answer. So we're very often in real life put in a situation where we have to answer a question, and someone gives us a tentative answer, and then we have to move away from that. So you can imagine even something like, you ask me would I like to go see, say, some new horror movie, and I have to decide whether I would like to or not, and probably my answer, part of the way my answer is going to emerge is in terms of what horror movie I think of that I last saw and whether I liked it or not. So, in fact, availability is coming into play here also. These are not mutually compatible at all. But if the first movie that comes to mind is a movie that I didn't like and I anchor my response on that, I'm likely to say no. If it's a movie that I did like, I'm likely to say yes. The way that you show the effects of anchoring in the lab, very simple experiment. You come in as a subject. The experimenter explains to you that he's just going to ask you to answer some fairly straightforward questions. And to give you an idea of the sort of answer that you ought to give, well, here's this wheel of fortune. So it's a wheel that has numbers from 0 to 100 on it, and there's a spinner in the middle. Kind of gives it a spin and says, so, I'm going to want you to give me an answer between 0 and 100, and here, for instance, is a number. Okay? It turns out that the wheel of fortune is rigged, so that it either stops on a low number, so a number like 10, say, is a low number, 0 to 100, or a high number, so something like, say, 85. Or 65, but something at the higher end of the scale. You next ask people the questions you'd like them to answer. So, for example, one of the questions is, what is the percentage of African nations in the United Nations? Now, I actually don't know what the real answer is, nor do the people in the experiment, so you're just asking them to make a judgment. What you find is that the judgment really, really is affected by the anchoring number you give them. If you give them a low number, so if you give them something like 10, they'll estimate that the percentage of nations, African nations in the United Nations, is 25%. If you give them this high random number, 65, they'll now give you an estimate of 45%. Okay? So again, you've given them a piece of information that has no value whatsoever. They've just spun this wheel of fortune, and their answer is very much reliant on this random piece of information. Now, once again, you can see this being used against you. And I'm going to turn back to the situation of buying a new car. So not only do you have reciprocity, but in fact, what you find is that what people end up paying for a new car really, really depends on the figure on which they're anchored. And so this is one of the reasons that car dealers will get you to produce a number. So when you go through this exercise of them sort of saying, well, how much do you think you'd pay for this car? Let's remember all of its features. It has 4 tires. They all turn at the same time. Or whatever. They celebrate its features, and then they ask you, how much do you think you'd have to pay for this car? And what they're hoping is that you'll come up with a very big number, that you'll come up with $30,000. Because once you have come up with that number, you have now set this expectation of what you're going to pay for it, and it's anchored on that number. And this is why they get very distressed if you come up with a low number, because they know already that you're going to be less likely to be able to buy a car from them because they're not going to want to sell it to you for such a small amount of money. So it's very important to them that you anchor on this high number, and this is why they'll throw around these numbers like, you might expect to pay $40,000 for this kind of car, $50,000, and you think, whoa, and then when they get down to the real number, you feel that it's all right. And in fact, it's very, very difficult, actually, to get rid of these kind of anchoring errors. You can give people perfectly ridiculous information. You can tell them, you might expect to pay $1 billion, and they'll think, oh, then I guess I'll have to pay $1 million for this car, and they'll say, great, I'll write the check. So it's a very, very hard error to get rid of. Once again, in most situations, it's fine, because the information that you're starting with turns out to be pretty high quality, but it does matter. Okay. So what I try to do is to give you some sense of how you cope with a lot of the information coming in. The point is that it is this constant buzz of information. There's a lot of it out there, and so you need these shortcuts to help you make these sorts of judgments. To end the lecture, I'd like to turn to one study where the information wasn't actually explicitly in the situation, in which people who were in some sense being persuaded by information, if you believe the interpretation of the data, weren't aware that they were being persuaded. This is some research now that was done by Mullen, Futrell, Stairs, Tice, Baumeister, Dawson, Reardon, Radloff, Goethals, Kennedy, and Rosenfeld. quite a lot of people. The reason there's so many people is because they were trying to collect data from all over the country, and I'll explain why. The way this study began was by all of these researchers taking newscasts from the 1984 election where the newscasters had been talking about either of the two candidates, so either Ronald Reagan or Walter Mondale. And what they did was to take these newscasts from the three major broadcasters, so Dan Rather, Tom Brokaw, and Peter Jennings. The first thing they did was to play these newscasts to raters to see if there's any difference in the actual content of the information that was offered for the two candidates. And the answer turned out to be no, that on the whole, all of the three newscasters were reporting pretty much the same information, that it was pretty equivalently positive or negative for the three candidates. The next thing they did was to turn down the volume so that you don't know what the newscaster is saying. All you can see is what he looks like when he's delivering the news. And now you find a difference. You find that Dan Rather and Tom Brokaw still look about the same when they're talking about the two candidates, but Peter Jennings is smiling just a little bit more when he's talking about Ronald Reagan. Okay, maybe it's because he's a Canadian. But he's smiling, he's smiling just a little bit more. That could go either way, so sorry. It's not meant to be a political comment. And that's a curious thing. So the question now, and this is why you suddenly get so many experimenters involved, what you want to do now is call up people, do a phone survey to see who people voted for, either Reagan or Mondale, as a function of what evening news show they were more likely to watch. And the answer is, if you look at the data I've provided, if you look at the people who watch CBS and NBC, so Rather or Brokaw, everyone, as you'll recall, everyone in this election, people voted disproportionately for Reagan, so you find that people who watch CBS or NBC are voting 62% for Reagan, 38% for Mondale. But if you look at the people who watch ABC, they are now voting 80% for Reagan and 20% for Mondale. I was very impressed when I first saw this result. Now, the most important sentence to utter in any kind of psychology class is that correlation is not causation. Just because two things go together doesn't mean they're causally related. But in fact, in this circumstance, this long list of authors, in fact, try to tell a causal story. That when these people on ABC were watching Peter Jennings, they were somehow picking up on this little bit of a smile when he was talking about Reagan. And even though he wasn't saying things that were nicer, they were sort of beginning to associate this more happy feeling with candidate Reagan. And therefore, when it came time to pull the lever in the ballot box, they were more likely to vote for Reagan. Okay? You might not believe that explanation, but if you don't, it still leaves you with having some responsibility to explain why these data turn out the way they do, because it's very striking that there was something about what was happening on Peter Jennings' newscast that was perhaps different than what was happening in the other two, and it's sort of an interesting result. What it suggests is that even when we're not aware of it, there are persuasive forces in our lives. What it also suggests is that information means a lot of things. So I entitled this lecture, I think, Coping with Social Information. The point is that sometimes the social information that you're asked to cope with is information that you're not even aware is in the environment. So there are a lot of things to think about in terms of that. And there are a lot of ways in which people are trying to affect us. And the point of this lecture is to give you a little bit more of a sense of how you respond to that, both in terms of why sometimes you can be persuaded, but also what you are doing with all the information around you.